Hello and welcome. Public speech allegedly expressing hate or inciting violence towards a person or group based on certain characteristics is defined as hate speech. So let's examine the precise definition of hate, which is characterized by intense aversion, hostility, or animosity towards someone or something. Powerful stuff. But by contrast, the non-hateful neutral act of posting humorous cartoons, sarcastic or critical comments, logically cannot generate an intense emotional response. At least a vehement reaction would not come from any sane or rational individual, especially vitriolic complaints coming from distant locations. Hate speech laws vary by jurisdiction and are supposed to provide redress for victimisation based on colour, ethnicity, national origin, race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, or the big furphy of gender identity. Well, that's all well and good, but altruistic outcomes are not what globalism's fascistic censorship laws are used for. Plus, in what twisted universe should the satanic perversity of gender identity ever have anything to do with law? The contrived ambiguity of hate speech laws makes them especially dangerous. Recent debates highlight the obvious pitfalls of vaguely defined hate speech laws, especially citing their damaging impact on freedom of expression, underscored by the grossly vindictive misuse by corrupt authorities. This intensifying abuse of law escalates rapidly while wreaking catastrophic consequences. At the heart of the issue lies the complication in defining hate speech. International law provides no clear definition, leaving globalist-controlled countries to interpret and implement dictatorial standards. Farcical ambiguity leads to inconsistent application and serious abuse of such laws. Wide-ranging misuse sees governments exploiting this open-ended vagueness to silence political opponents, crush dissenters, and jail critics, even harmless flag wavers. The indefinable nature of such laws permits the targeting of legitimate speech under the disingenuous guise of combating the capricious vagaries of so-called hate. The intentional lack of clarity in hate speech legislation railroads relentless suppression of public discourse. Individuals may self-censor out of fear that their words will be misconstrued or fall afoul of poorly defined laws. Lawmakers have a constitutional obligation to balance protecting vulnerable groups from harmful speech while preserving the fundamental right to free expression. However, fairness and logic only apply in a world where sanity still prevails. This ongoing abuse of law gets further complicated by the contextual nature of hate speech, which can vary based on cultural, political, and social factors. The approach to hate speech laws differs significantly across countries. The United States doesn't have a specific hate speech legislation prioritizing First Amendment protections. Many European countries implement stricter hate speech regulations. The Asia-Pacific region has various approaches reflecting diverse cultural and legal traditions. The rise of online platforms adds another layer of complexity to the hate speech debacle. Social media companies struggle to moderate content effectively, often relying on automated systems lacking the nuance required to interpret context and intent. Independent media channels repeatedly demand more precise legislation defining prohibited speech while safeguarding legitimate expression. Some suggest adopting the criteria outlined in the Rabat Plan of Action, which guides identifying speech that incites discrimination, hostility, or violence. As we grapple with these challenges, the debate surrounding hate speech laws continues to evolve. Finding the right balance between protecting vulnerable groups and preserving free speech remains a complex challenge for lawmakers and courts worldwide. However, given the criminal nature of globalist captured governments everywhere, it's painfully clear that hate speech laws are not for the protection of vulnerable groups, but exist to suppress dissent and target political opponents. For example, in many countries, vaguely defined hate speech laws are weaponized against critics of the government. In Russia, Article 282 of the Criminal Code, which prohibits incitement of hatred or enmity, is used to prosecute opposition figures and activists who speak out against government policies. Some politicians have labelled Black Lives Matter advocacy as hate speech, while in contrast, others in turn denounce that very denunciation as hate speech, illustrating how the term is routinely manipulated for political purposes. Ironically, laws ostensibly designed to protect minorities are now used against them. In India, hate speech laws are selectively enforced due to political or religious factors, thereby failing to protect religious minorities. In Malaysia, broadly drafted hate speech offences result in prosecutions effectively criminalising lawful expression or governmental dissent. The vague nature of these laws allows governments to restrict legitimate speech, which now occurs with disturbing repetition and punishing consequences. In Cambodia and Indonesia, overly broad criminal hate speech offences are used to prosecute forms of expression that should be protected under free speech principles. Even in supposedly democratic countries, hate speech laws are interpreted to silence debate on sensitive social issues, inhibiting critical public discussions. Some countries have retained and repurposed colonial-era laws designed initially to suppress anti-colonial sentiment. Nations like Bangladesh, Singapore, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and India have kept sedition offences from colonial penal codes. These laws, originally meant to prevent hostility against colonial governments, are now used to prosecute various forms of speech under the deceitful guise of combating hate. While the original intent behind such laws may be to protect vulnerable groups, their implementation is now egregiously perverted to achieve the opposite effect, undermining free expression and democratic discourse. In Rwanda, hate speech legislation is routinely wielded as a tool of brutal repression against political opposition and dissent. The government has broadly interpreted concepts like sectarianism and genocide ideology to include criticism of government policies or calls for prosecution of war crimes. This has silenced many voices, including those from minority groups. In some countries, hate speech laws have been selectively enforced in unacceptable ways. For example, in India, there's growing concerns about the uneven application of such laws along religious lines. In Malaysia, broadly drafted hate speech offences have led to prosecutions that effectively criminalise legitimate expression by minority groups or government critics. Even in allegedly democratic countries, vague hate speech laws are interpreted to silence debate on sensitive social issues. In Cambodia and Indonesia, overly broad criminal hate speech offences are used to prosecute all forms of expression that should, again, be protected under free speech principles, including speech by minority groups. These examples highlight how the vague nature of many hate speech laws can allow for their misuse against the very groups they were ostensibly designed to protect. As noted by some experts, when minority groups are weak, despised, or feared by the majority, they are unlikely to obtain protection through hate speech laws. This underscores the serious danger of poorly defined hate speech legislation, which is consistently weaponized against vulnerable communities, independent media, critically thinking reporters, and sovereign defenders of freedom. Globalism's distortion of the rule of law now ushers in history's most dangerous genocidal tyranny. Along with countless other independent social media outlets, we've consistently forewarned this exact scenario, only to endure the unhinged outrage of woke imbeciles the world over. These hopelessly brainwashed buffoons now celebrate as teenagers, one youngster, 11 years old, get jailed under egregiously false pretences by the UK's terminally corrupted courts. Some alleged offences are for the harmlessly non-criminal action of waving a flag. All criminality is exclusively constrained to the globalist traitors via their demolition of society. These satanic ghouls now wield the corruption of law as their primary weapon, wherein an Australian court has now ludicrously ruled that men can become women. They can't. This attempt to wipe out biological sex in law might just prove the last straw. Well, let's hope so. Thank you.